The sea was calm that morning, deceptively calm, as if unaware that history was about to shift on its waves. On August 7, 1942, the first rays of the Pacific sun fell upon a line of American ships silently approaching a stretch of Greenland Guadalcanal. To most of the men aboard, the name meant nothing. It was just another island in a vast blue ocean, another dot on a map. But in a few hours, it would become a word etched into their bones, a name whispered in memories for decades to come. Guadalcanal, the first offensive of the United States against Japan in the long, brutal war across the Pacific. Just months earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor was still a fresh scar. The Philippines had fallen, and British colonies across Asia had been crushed. The Japanese Empire had spread its tentacles from Burma to New Guinea, threatening to isolate Australia. America was reeling, recovering, and angry. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his generals had decided that the time for retreat was over. The island of Guadalcanal, in the Solomon Islands chain, was not a famous place, but it had something Japan wanted: an airfield. The Japanese had begun constructing it to dominate the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If they succeeded, the Allies' lifeline to the south would be cut. Washington could not allow that to happen. For weeks, intelligence reports had trickled in: Japanese engineers building runways, supplies being ferried by barges, small garrisons stationed along the beaches. It wasn't a fortress yet, but it soon would be. The U.S. High Command, led by Admiral Ernest King and General Douglas MacArthur, debated where to strike first. They needed a target that was both strategic and achievable. Guadalcanal became that target. Operation Watchtower was born, a bold plan to seize the island before the Japanese could fortify it. The men of the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, had been training for months, but few were ready for what awaited them. Many had never seen combat. They were young 19, 20, 21 sons of farmers, factory workers, and teachers, now carrying rifles and packs heavier than their bodies. On the night before the landing, as the ships approached their destination, a strange silence spread across the decks. Some men prayed, some wrote letters they would never send, and others stared into the dark horizon, listening to the hum of the engines and wondering if they would live to see the next sunrise. At dawn, the bombardment began. U.S. Navy cruisers and destroyers opened fire, shaking the sea with their thunder. Smoke and fire rose from the jungles as shells crashed into the island. The Marines climbed into landing crafts, the small, open boats that would carry them to shore, and the engines roared forward. Waves splashed over the sides. The men could see the green outline of the island growing larger, closer, until it filled the horizon. No one fired back. No Japanese defenders appeared. Some Marines whispered, "Where the hell are they?" When they reached the beaches, there was no resistance. The Japanese had withdrawn inland, leaving behind construction equipment, half-built huts, and a partially completed airstrip. By evening, the Marines realized what they had taken: Henderson Field, named later after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. The airfield would soon become the heart of the struggle for Guadalcanal, a prize that both sides would kill for. For a moment, victory seemed easy. The Americans set up camp, unloaded supplies, and joked that maybe the war wasn't so hard after all. But the illusion didn't last long. That night, as darkness fell, the sound of engines echoed from the sea. Japanese bombers appeared out of the black sky, dropping their deadly cargo on the beaches. Explosions ripped through the darkness, setting supply dumps ablaze. Then came the ships, Japanese warships striking like sharks, shelling the American transports. In a few hours, much of the U.S. Navy's support was gone. The next morning, when the sun rose, the Marines realized the unthinkable: their fleet had withdrawn, leaving them stranded on an island surrounded by enemy waters. The Marines were alone. Food was limited. Ammunition was scarce. The tropical heat was suffocating, and mosquitoes carried malaria like an invisible army. The jungle seemed alive, whispering, crawling, suffused with danger. From the tree line came the first Japanese counterattacks, sudden, fierce, and merciless. The enemy appeared like ghosts, charging through the darkness, screaming, bayonets glinting. The Marines fought with desperation, using rifles, machine guns, and sometimes their bare hands. The nights were filled with the sound of gunfire and the screams of the wounded. Yet, amid the chaos, the Americans held the airfield. Every inch of Guadalcanal became a test of endurance, not just against the Japanese, but against the island itself. The rain never stopped. Mud swallowed their boots. Supplies rotted before they could be eaten. Men fell ill with malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion. The living carried the sick buried the dead. Letters home described the island as hell with palm trees. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, the Japanese high command could not believe that the Americans had landed so soon. Guadalcanal, they thought, was a minor post, not worth heavy defense. But now, with the airfield lost, they realized its importance. Orders went out to recapture it at any cost. Reinforcements were gathered, ships loaded, and the infamous Tokyo Express fast destroyers carrying troops and supplies by night began its deadly runs down the slot of the Solomon Islands. The battle for Guadalcanal was no longer a raid, it was a full-scale campaign. In Washington, Roosevelt and his generals watched anxiously. Victory was far from certain. The U.S. Navy had suffered heavy losses in early naval engagements, and many admirals feared another disaster. But there was no turning back. Guadalcanal was now a symbol, a test of whether America could stand and fight in the Pacific. As August turned into September, the lines hardened. Every day brought air raids, jungle skirmishes, and naval clashes off the coast. The Marines nicknamed the surrounding waters Iron Bottom Sound, because so many ships, American and Japanese alike, had sunk there. The island smelled of death, smoke, and salt. Yet, amid that nightmare, courage persisted. Pilots from Henderson Field, flying ragged planes held together with spare parts, fought Japanese bombers and Zero fighters with relentless bravery. Every flight was a gamble. Every landing, a miracle. By the end of that first month, the men who had landed full of confidence were changed forever. Their faces were lean, eyes hollow, uniforms torn and dirty. They had seen what war truly was: not glory, not headlines, but endurance, hunger, fear, and comradeship forged in blood. They didn't know it yet, but Guadalcanal was just beginning. Reinforcements were coming from both sides, and the jungle island was about to become the most brutal battlefield of the Pacific. And as another night fell over the steaming jungles, the Marines listened to the distant rumble of naval guns offshore and knew the island of shadows would not let them sleep tonight. The night of fire. The night began with silence, the kind of silence that hides danger in its lungs. It was mid-August 1942, just days after the first American boots had touched the shores of Guadalcanal. The men were exhausted, drenched in sweat, and sick of the endless hum of insects. The jungle was too quiet that evening. Somewhere in the Black Sea beyond the shore, ships were moving, not American, but Japanese. The veterans among the Marines felt it in their bones. "They're coming," someone whispered. No one slept that night. Then, without warning, the horizon lit up. The Japanese Navy had arrived, sleek destroyers and cruisers cutting through the darkness like knives. Flares burst in the sky, turning the ocean into a blinding daylight of chaos. Within seconds, the still air was shattered by thunderous explosions. Shells screamed over the waves and slammed into the anchored American ships. The Battle of Savo Island had begun, the first major naval clash around Guadalcanal, and a nightmare for the U.S. fleet. On the decks of the American cruisers, sailors scrambled, shouting orders through the roar of guns. But the attack was too sudden, too perfect. The Japanese, trained for night combat, struck with deadly precision. One American ship after another burst into flames. The sea itself seemed to burn. By dawn, 4 Allied cruisers lay at the bottom of the ocean. The Marines on shore watched helplessly from the beaches as the glow of the burning ships painted the horizon red. When the sun rose, the ocean was quiet again. Iron Bottom Sound had earned its name. By the morning of August 9, the grim truth settled in. The U.S. Navy had withdrawn, fearing another ambush. The Marines on Guadalcanal were now isolated, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. What was supposed to be a quick operation had become a desperate fight for survival. The Japanese were regrouping in the jungles, gathering strength for a counterattack. From that moment, every meal, every bullet, every breath was rationed. The men had come to take an island, and now the island had taken them hostage. The days dragged into weeks. The heat was merciless, the rain endless. Food spoiled within hours, water was tainted. Men fell sick with malaria and dysentery. Their skin turned yellow, their bodies thin. They called themselves the starving Marines. At night, the enemy's presence was everywhere, unseen, unheard, but always felt. Japanese snipers hid in the trees. Scouts vanished into the jungle and never returned. Sometimes, the soldiers would hear soft rustling and whispers in Japanese, close, too close, followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. On August 21, the first major ground assault came. The Japanese launched a surprise attack along the Tenere River, a shallow stream that cut through the island's thick undergrowth. It was just before dawn when the sentries heard the faint splash of boots in the water. Then came the shouting, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging across the river, bayonets gleaming. The Marines opened fire with machine guns and rifles, the muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like a lightning storm. The attackers came in waves, fearless and screaming. They called it banzai charge, a suicidal rush that sought to overwhelm by sheer force. The Americans held their ground. The river turned red. By sunrise, the attack had failed. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay tangled among the reeds, their cries fading into silence. For the first time, the Marines had faced a full-scale assault and survived. The price was high, but Guadalcanal still belonged to them. When General Vandegrift walked through the aftermath, he said nothing. The men didn't cheer. They had learned what the enemy was capable of and what victory truly cost. Far to the north, in Rabaul, the Japanese command was furious. Losing Guadalcanal was unthinkable. The Imperial Army gathered thousands of reinforcements and prepared for a second, even larger offensive. Every night, their destroyers, nicknamed the Tokyo Express, raced down the narrow channels of the Solomon Islands, bringing fresh troops and supplies to the island. By day, American aircraft from Henderson Field tried to bomb them. By night, the sea belonged to Japan. In the skies above Guadalcanal, dogfights became a daily ritual. American pilots flying from the dusty airstrip fought Japanese Zero fighters in desperate aerial battles. The airfield itself became both fortress and lifeline, the only thing keeping the Marines alive. Without Henderson Field, they would be blind, helpless and cut off. Each day the Japanese tried to destroy it, each day, somehow, it survived. Then came September. The rains grew heavier, turning the island into a swamp. Supplies were running low. Many Marines lived on captured Japanese rice and what little food they could scavenge. The enemy was closing in again. On the night of September 12th, the Japanese struck the Marine lines at a ridge near the airfield. It was the fiercest fighting yet. The Marines, dug into shallow foxholes, faced waves of charging soldiers, their shouts piercing through the rain and darkness. The battle raged all night, with bayonets, grenades, and hand-to-hand combat. When morning came, hundreds of Japanese lay dead at the base of what would forever be known as Edson's Ridge, named after Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, whose men had held the line against impossible odds. That victory saved Henderson Field and perhaps the entire campaign. The Japanese had thrown everything they had into the assault and failed. Yet even in defeat, they refused to stop. The sea around Guadalcanal became a graveyard of ships. Every few nights, the sky would glow again as warships exchanged fire. The roar of naval guns echoed across the island, shaking the very ground. The Marines had learned to read those sounds: the booming of heavy shells, the rising pitch of aircraft engines, the dull thud of distant explosions. It was the rhythm of their new life. But for every Japanese ship sunk, another arrived. The men began to realize that they weren't just fighting for a piece of land, they were fighting against an empire that refused to die. Letters from home took months to arrive. Some never did. News was scarce, but rumors filled the gaps of massive fleets assembling, of reinforcements on the way, of hope just beyond the horizon. Until then, the only thing that mattered was surviving the next day. As October approached, Guadalcanal had become more than a battle, it was a test of will. The Marines' bodies were weak, but their spirits were unbroken. They joked about their misery, laughed at death, and found strength in each other. The sound of planes overhead, American planes, became music. Every time they saw one land safely on Henderson Field, they knew they still had a chance. That night, when the jungle fell silent again, the men sat in their trenches, staring at the stars through a canopy of clouds. Somewhere out there, beyond the dark sea, home existed: clean beds, warm food, the faces of loved ones. But here, on this cursed island, there was only the war, the endless green jungle, and the certainty that the Japanese would come again. They always did. In the distance, thunder rolled over the water. The men couldn't tell if it was a storm or the sound of ships arriving. Someone muttered softly, "Another night of fire." He was right. The turning tide. The night sky over Guadalcanal was burning again. The horizon flickered orange, reflecting off the restless sea. It was October 1942, and by now, the men on the island could tell time not by the sun or stars, but by the rhythm of explosions. Every night brought thunder, sometimes from the heavens, but more often from the Japanese Navy. The soldiers called it the nightly fireworks, though there was nothing to celebrate. It was the sound of survival, of another battle being fought just beyond sight. By now, the Marines had been on Guadalcanal for more than 2 months. They were thinner, harder, and older in spirit. The disease had hollowed them, but something fierce glowed behind their eyes, a refusal to give up. The Japanese had thrown wave after wave at them, but the Americans were still there, holding the muddy airstrip that had become the heart of the war, Henderson Field. Every crate of ammunition, every sack of rice, every wounded man revolved around that patch of dirt. If Henderson fell, Guadalcanal would fall. And if Guadalcanal fell, the Pacific would belong to Japan again. Far away, in Washington and Tokyo, men in suits and uniforms studied maps and planned their next moves. But on the island, war was stripped of politics. It was mud, sweat, and survival. For the men crouched in foxholes, the world had shrunk to a few hundred yards of jungle. Every sound in the dark, a branch snapping, a whisper in the leaves, might be death. The Japanese were preparing for another grand assault. After their defeat at Edson's Ridge, they had gathered thousands of new troops on nearby islands. General Hirokichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, believed that one powerful strike could break the Americans. His men, veterans of China and the jungles of New Guinea, were confident. They saw the Americans as weak, sickly, and outnumbered. They didn't know that those sickly Marines had learned how to fight the jungle itself. By mid-October, Japanese ships began flooding the coast again, their silhouettes cutting across the moonlit sea. The Tokyo Express was in full swing, bringing reinforcements and artillery. The Americans knew something big was coming. They fortified every trench, dug deeper, repaired what they could of the airfield. Pilots of the Cactus Air Force, the name given to the small group of American flyers based at Henderson, flew almost non-stop missions. Their planes were patched with tape and bullet holes, but they kept flying. Each one knew that if they didn't, the next Japanese convoy would reach the island unharmed. On October 13, the night came alive. Two massive Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, appeared offshore. Their guns opened fire, unleashing more than 1,000 shells on Henderson Field. The bombardment lasted for over an hour. The ground trembled. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Planes burned on the runway, fuel depots exploded, and men dived into trenches as the world around them turned into fire. It was one of the most intense naval bombardments of the entire war. When dawn broke, Henderson Field was a cratered wasteland. Yet somehow, the Americans got it running again within hours. That resilience would become the defining spirit of Guadalcanal. 2 days later, the Japanese launched their ground assault. It began with artillery fire, then waves of infantry emerging from the jungle mist. They attacked the southern perimeter of the airfield, where Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller commanded his Marines, a name that would soon become legendary. The Japanese came in relentless waves, shouting and firing, their bayonets gleaming in the flash of machine guns. But Puller's men held. For 2 nights, they fought off charge after charge, their ammunition nearly gone, their nerves frayed. At dawn, the field was littered with bodies. The Americans had lost dozens. The Japanese had lost thousands. But victory came at a terrible cost. Henderson Field was barely functioning. Supplies were dwindling. The men were malnourished and sick. The U.S. Navy still hesitated to commit its full strength to the island, haunted by earlier defeats. Yet in those desperate days, something began to shift. American resolve hardened, and the Japanese grip began to slip. In late October, the Japanese launched what would be their last great effort to retake Guadalcanal, the battle for Henderson Field. For 3 nights, the jungle erupted with fire. The ground shook beneath artillery shells, the air filled with screams and smoke. On the 3rd night, the Americans counterattacked with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, even bayonets. When the sun rose on October 26, the Japanese offensive was broken. Their commander, General Maruyama, had lost over 3,000 men. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. While the Marines fought on land, the sea around the island boiled with steel. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands raged in late October, a carrier clash that left both sides bleeding. American carriers Hornet and Enterprise fought valiantly against superior Japanese numbers. The Hornet was lost, but the Japanese fleet withdrew, their aircrews shattered. The tide was turning, though no one on Guadalcanal could see it yet. By November, the rains had turned the island into a swamp of despair. Men fought not only the enemy but also the jungle, the mud sucking at their boots, the mosquitoes whining endlessly. Yet, amid all this misery, hope flickered. More American reinforcements were arriving. Navy convoys, once too afraid to approach, now braved the waters. Henderson Field was operational again, its aircraft dominating the skies during daylight. The Japanese, desperate and starving, prepared one final attempt. In early November, their largest supply convoy yet, 11 transports escorted by powerful warships, sailed toward Guadalcanal. If it succeeded, the balance might tilt back in Japan's favor. The Americans knew they had to stop it, no matter the cost. Thus began the most brutal naval clash of the campaign, the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. On the night of November 12, the sea around the island became an inferno. American and Japanese ships collided at point-blank range, trading fire so close that sailors could see the faces of the enemy in the muzzle flashes. The water burned. Battleships and cruisers erupted in flame, their metal hulls glowing red. It was chaos, raw, furious, human chaos. The USS Atlanta, USS Cushing, and many others went down, but so did the Japanese flagship WWII. For 3 days and nights, the fighting didn't stop. Even when the Japanese tried to land their troops, American planes from Henderson swooped down, bombing the transports to ruins. By November 15, the sea was littered with wrecks. Nearly all of Japan's reinforcements had been destroyed before reaching shore. Guadalcanal had devoured them. When the sun rose that morning, the island was quiet again. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and death. The Marines looked out over the water and saw the floating wreckage ships, bodies, pieces of a broken dream. For the first time since August, they allowed themselves a thought they had never dared to think: maybe they could actually win. That night, when the tired men sat around their foxholes, one of them said softly, "They're not coming back from this." No one answered, but they all knew he was right. The tide of the Pacific had turned not with a single victory, but through months of endurance, fear, and blood. And somewhere out on that dark sea, as the waves lapped against the burned hulls of ships, history began to shift. The Empire of Japan had reached its high water mark. From here on, the tide would only fall. The last dawn. The jungle was quiet, too quiet. For the first time in months, the guns had fallen silent. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of rain, but beneath it, something else stirred, a strange, unfamiliar feeling the Marines could barely recognize. It was peace. Or at least, something that felt like it. The men didn't dare believe it yet, but deep down, they knew, Guadalcanal was dying, and with it, the Japanese dream of conquest was bleeding out into the Pacific. It was November 1942, and after 3 months of unrelenting hell, the Americans had done what once seemed impossible: they had stopped the Japanese advance. The battle for Henderson Field was over, the Tokyo Express shattered, and the sea no longer belonged entirely to the rising sun. But even victory felt hollow. The island was a graveyard for ships, for planes, for men. Every inch of jungle had a story, every tree a memory. The sound of the waves hitting the shore was almost too gentle, as if the island itself was trying to forget what it had witnessed. The surviving Marines looked nothing like the soldiers who had landed in August. Their faces were lean and ghostly, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow but burning with something indestructible. They had arrived as boys, they would leave as something else, something carved by fire and fear and the will to endure. "We held," one Marine whispered as he looked across the wrecked airfield, now pockmarked with craters and graves. "God help us, we held." While the Americans repaired their positions and waited for supplies, the Japanese commanders faced an agonizing truth. Guadalcanal was lost. Their army, ravaged by hunger, disease, and constant bombardment, could no longer fight. Out of the tens of thousands sent to the island, barely a fraction could still stand. The Imperial High Command had called it the Island of Death, and they weren't wrong. General Hyakutake begged Tokyo for reinforcements, but Japan's resources were bleeding away. The once invincible empire was stretched thin across Asia and the Pacific. For the first time, Japanese generals began to talk not of attack, but of survival. In the villages and shattered jungle clearings of Guadalcanal, the reality of war lingered like smoke. Bodies rotted in shallow graves. The heat never broke. At night, the men still woke to phantom gunfire, their minds reliving the ambushes and the screams. The sound of mosquitoes was louder than the silence. Yet amid all of it, the American presence on the island grew stronger. Supplies poured in. Fresh troops replaced the exhausted veterans. What began as a desperate defense was slowly turning into domination. December came with heavy rains and a new kind of war. The Japanese had stopped attacking in force, but they hadn't given up. Small units still crept through the jungle, sniping, ambushing, harassing the American lines. They were ghosts, starving, sick, but unwilling to surrender. Some fought until the last bullet, others simply faded into the forest. The Marines learned to listen to the night again, not for armies, but for single footsteps, for the sharp crack of a rifle that could end a life in the dark. Out at sea, the Americans had taken control. The once invincible Japanese Navy was bleeding. Destroyers and cruisers prowled the waters like wolves, hunting the last remnants of the Tokyo Express. For every Japanese ship that tried to sneak through, American planes from Henderson Field were waiting. The airfield that had once been bombed into rubble now stood as a fortress. Its patched-up planes, the so-called Cactus Air Force, ruled the skies. But victory, like everything on Guadalcanal, came at a cost. The men were haunted not by fear, but by memory. They had seen friends vanish in the jungle, swallowed by the island without a trace. They had burned enemy bodies in silence, wondering if anyone would remember them either. Some of the Marines had started giving names to places that had no maps: Bloody Ridge, Coffin Corner, Hell's Point, as if naming the horrors made them easier to live with. Others simply stopped talking altogether. January 1943 brought whispers the Japanese were retreating. At first, no one believed it. Guadalcanal had been a nightmare that never ended, surely it couldn't just stop. But the signs were there. Fewer air raids. Fewer ships offshore. The enemy's gunfire, once constant, now came in short bursts, fading away into the distance. The Marines started finding abandoned camps, half-buried rifles, letters written in Japanese, ration tins gnawed empty. The jungle was swallowing the invaders it had once sheltered. The truth came on February 9, 1943. After 6 months of battle, the Japanese had finally evacuated the last of their soldiers under the cover of darkness. More than 10,000 men were pulled from the island in a desperate operation the Americans didn't even notice until it was over. When the news reached the American lines, no one cheered. There were no celebrations, no speeches. The men were too tired, too hollow. They simply sat in silence, staring out over the quiet beaches where so many had died. Guadalcanal was theirs, but the victory felt like surviving a storm rather than winning a war. For the United States, Guadalcanal was more than just an island, it was proof. Proof that the Japanese could be beaten. Proof that America could fight, endure, and win in a war it had barely begun to understand. It was the first link in a long chain that would stretch across the Pacific through Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa all the way to the gates of Japan itself. For Japan, Guadalcanal was a wound that never healed. The loss shattered their myth of invincibility and forced them into a defensive war they could never win. Months later, when the veterans of Guadalcanal returned to civilization, they found it strange. The noise of cities, the laughter of people, the lights at night, it all felt unreal. They had left part of themselves behind, buried in the mud and mangrove roots of that distant island. Many could still smell the rot, the gunpowder, the fear. Some spoke of it, most didn't. But in the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through palm trees or the smell of rain hit the earth, they would remember the roar of the ocean, the rattle of gunfire, and the faces of the brothers who never came home. In Washington, newspapers called it America's first great victory in the Pacific. But for the men who had fought there, victory was a word that felt too clean, too simple. Guadalcanal hadn't been about triumph, it had been about endurance, about holding on when everything else broke. It was not the glory of battle they remembered, but the sound of their own hearts still beating after 6 months of madness. As dawn broke on February 10, 1943, a thin mist hung over the island. Sunlight filtered through the broken palm trees and fell across Henderson Field, where American planes sat waiting for their next mission. A group of Marines stood by the shore, watching the waves. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but something inside them had shifted. They had faced the worst, and they were still standing. One of them bent down, picked up a handful of wet sand, and let it slip through his fingers. "We came for this," he said quietly. "And somehow, we lived." The sea breeze carried his words away, out over Iron Bottom Sound, where the rusting hulls of ships still slept beneath the water. The island was quiet again. The battle was over. But the echoes of Guadalcanal, the screams, the courage, the silence would live forever in the hearts of those who had walked its haunted shores.